And now I'm bringing Chris on. Chris is the Chief Marketing Officer for Figures Toy Company and just an overall good dude. What's up, man?
Hey, what's going on, man? Good to hear from you.
So we've been talking about recording something together for a little bit. I am an old school WWE figure collector. What the big rubber ones? What was the company that made them?
That was the original LJN line back in the 80s.
So I mean, when those figures came out, I had the ones that the ones that you could find. I think my big get at some point was like King Kong Bundy because I wanted the steel cage match with Hogan. But the one thing I always wondered about those figures is you remember the commercials that they would do, and then they would kind of show all the figures standing ringside. And those of us who had VCRs back then, we would always pause it to make sure we could make out who the figures are that were coming out. And for the life of me, I couldn't get all the ones that I wanted. Like, I finally found the British Bulldogs like at a garage sale, but I could never find them in like stores. Have you followed the history of how they, what they decided to release in different areas of the U.S.? Like, do you know any of the history about that line?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, with that line, even like towards the end, they didn't even get to release a lot of the figures they wanted to. Like, they only released Demolition Axe and Smash never came out. And like a lot of those like latter day figures are actually some of the rarest ones just because of the distribution, because at various points you kind of had the market flooded with all the common figures. Like Big John Studd was pretty common, and Cowboy Bob Orton, and kind of like, mid-carders and whatnot. So a lot of people, once they had the Hogans, the Andres, everything like that, they just weren't buying them anymore, and the newer figures just weren't shipping as much. So it wasn't even really like a geographical thing as much of also like from the sales perspective. It kind of goes along with what they said about the Masters of the Universe line. Once He-Man and Skeletor sold out, people didn't really want the fringe characters if they couldn't have the main characters. So if you're not finding Hogan and Andre and Macho Man and those guys around, that's why a lot of the other guys were kind of just sitting on the shelves, and they didn't ship as many for the future series.
And I know they released a second Hogan, and I think he's like wearing like a white shirt and like a red headband or something. And then there was a second Andre, which was in the 87 version of Andre with the singlet rather than just the trunks and the afro. So it did seem like they were like, okay, we have to continually, put out Hogans and Andres because we're not selling some of these other guys.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly did a couple of reissues and repaints and restocks, and a lot of re's there. They did do a lot on that, but it was just, the main thing towards the end, especially with some of those sets, was I wasn't seeing them in stores. And when I was a kid, I was at the toy store literally every weekend. It was kind of like a tradition that my grandparents would pick me up on Saturday afternoons, and locally we had a Toys R Us, and we had a store that was big on the East Coast called Child World, and they would take me to both of them and just kind of let me run free and choose various things. And obviously the wrestling figures was like the main thing that I was drifted towards. But a lot of those figures, like I mentioned, the Demolition Axe, Ultimate Warrior, Haku, Ravishing Rick Rude, I never actually saw them in stores until later in life in collectors stores, but I would always see them on the inside covers or the back covers of the Aftermax.
Yep.
There was a big ad for LJN, and that's how I started realizing that those figures came out. And I remember that my grandmother actually called to order some of them, and at that point, either the ad or the figures themselves had been discontinued, and I never got my hands on them. And then years later, discovering that they were some of the rarest figures produced by WWF.
And it is interesting because it seems like they were pretty, like they had gone into this thinking like every kid is going to want every figure, because they were even making job guys like SD Jones. Like I was like, there's an SD Jones figure, and I've never seen this thing ever in existence. So it seemed, they probably thought, I guess, that they were just going to sell these things by the truckload based on all the guys that they were producing figures of.
Yeah, I mean, they were definitely going deep. I mean, you had SD Jones, you had Outback Jack, you had Corporal Kirshner. So there were a lot of fringe guys, and I think that just had to do with the period we were in at that time. That was the boom period, and pretty much everybody from the top of the card on down had some type of recognizable gimmick or memorable character. So, they just wanted to see who was going to translate into sales, which was kind of good on their part, because if you had a guy who was semi-popular or semi-known from the weekend shows or something like that, we didn't have the merchandising bonanza that we have now with WWE Shop and things like that. So that could have also been a way to test to see just how popular those guys were.
So you talked about earlier how your grandparents would take you to the store. Like, what was when you're growing up, what is the thing that draws you to the figures? Because, I mean, there's other things in a toy store other than figures. But for, I imagine for a lot of young male children like us, the figures were the thing that kind of stood out. But what was it about figures, and what was kind of like your first line of figures that you were just like, you just had to have?
The first line of figures, it wasn't even necessarily a line of figures, but a lot of people may or may not know this. I'm a huge fan of the Incredible Hulk, just the character in and of itself. And that's partially for sentimental reasons, because the first toy I can ever recall getting, and I was like 2-3 years old. I was very young, but I have vivid memories of this to this day. And it was the old school 70s Incredible Hulk made by Mego. Mm-hmm. So they were almost like kind of like doll-like, and it was a 12-inch Hulk doll.
Yeah, I remember.
And when I was a kid, picture Linus from Peanuts with his blue blanket. Like, that Hulk came with me wherever I went. That was my blue blanket. And so anything involving the Incredible Hulk, my grandparents would always get me. I was always drawn to it. And when I got a little bit older, 4 or 5 years old, the reruns of the Bill Bixby, Lou Ferrigno show were on locally on Saturday afternoons. So after my grandmother went to work at the family bakery, my grandfather and I, my papa and I, would go back to the house. And, it was kind of like, back in the day, you take the phone off the hook. You don't want anyone to bother you. And he and I would sit there for an hour. And that was kind of like the Papa Chris time, where we would watch the Incredible Hulk TV show. So right up to this point in my life, I've got a whole assortment of Hulk figures and memorabilia. So the Marvel stuff, the Hulk stuff always drew me in. The wrestling stuff, obviously. And Masters of the Universe was my other big get. At one point, before they started really pumping out the repaints and the hard-to-find characters towards the end, I had the complete collection of Masters of the Universe, including vehicles and play sets.
So I remember my mom gave away my Star Wars figures. I had the Darth Vader helmet thing that would hold all the figures.
Oh, the carry case, yep.
The carry case. And this is before, we knew that these things were worth anything. And then, when she just started giving them away, and then we find out that they're actually worth something, is actually like it was a little bit of a whoa. Like, this stuff could be worth something. And then, as I get a little bit older, I start trading cards, and then you understand that, oh, these cards are probably of some value as well. When you're growing up, you have this set of toys. Obviously, you're not thinking about, oh, I should keep them because they're going to be valuable. You're just thinking as a normal kid, I just want to collect these because I love these. But at what point did you sort of realize that this was more than just a kid thing and it was actually a hobby?
Probably around like, my like 12, 13-year-old time frame, like early teens, because like you mentioned, collecting cards and stuff. I had been collecting comics since I was about 5 or 6 years old, collecting baseball cards and basketball cards, stuff like that as well. So with the cards, my grandfather would either buy the set, so I'd have like the kind of like the sealed box and the set was already put together, or we'd buy the boxes and we'd buy the binders with the clear plastic sleeves and put all the cards in order, and we'd kind of like make a day of it. That'd be a thing that we would do. And with the comics, when I was younger, I'd thumb through them, throw them aside. So, the staples are popping out and the cover's half torn off and everything. Mm-hmm. And it was probably around the time of, that 90s comic book boom and the trading card boom where they started mass producing everything, which is funny to say because looking back on it, a lot of that stuff is kind of worthless with how much they produced for it.
Yep.
But back then, it was kind of thinking that, the collector's market went really high on the cards from the 60s, the 70s, and the early 80s. This stuff's going to be valuable someday too. So that's when I started taking a lot of care of it. And with the action figures, I was always really kind of OCD about my figures, making sure like the hands weren't bent too far off and the weapons fit and all that stuff. So like with the Masters of the Universe of the wrestlers, if the time came where I was like, I'm not playing with these anymore, instead of tossing them out for a yard sale or anything, my parents would just kind of put them away, like seal them up in a box and stick them in the basement. So to this day, I mean, my son Zach, you're familiar with him, but he actually plays with some of my original He-Man guys that were like duplicates are still in my parents' basement because he discovered the show on Netflix and he's like, I want to buy these. And it's like, if you look for He-Man guys now, you're either finding the vintage ones or these collector editions that they're charging like 40, 50 bucks a pop for.
Right.
So I was like, hey, there's some in Grandma and Papa's basement. Let me go down and pull them up for you. So, they're in good enough condition that they've held up for over 30 years that my son is playing with them now.
So I do want to get to your job and what you do and how your fandom sort of created opportunities for you. But two other main questions before we get to that. What is your favorite wrestling figure line?
The WWF Hasbro figures, the ones that came after the LGN, the smaller kind of snap action ones, like you can make them jump and everything. That line, I collected that line right up to the bitter end. I was so happy when Mattel decided to kind of copy that pattern and they started doing them. And it's actually kind of timely that we bring that up because Mattel actually just announced that after these next couple of waves that already went into production, they're actually canceling the line and they're not intending to release any more in 2020.
Wow.
So, yeah, I guess, they certainly made a good move targeting the older collectors like myself and like others. But I guess as far as a mainstream level, they're not moving. I mean, I see them on the shelves at my Target all the time. And the young kids.
You think that has that have to do with the popularity of the product?
I think it has to do with the popularity of the product. And I think it has to do with the target audience, because if you've got that younger kid, John Cena, Roman Reigns, Seth Rollins type of audience, those figures, they want the figures that are kind of universal. They want the figures that match up. So they're going to want a 6-inch, Cesaro and Sheamus to go and fight their Shield guys versus having these retro style Seth Rollins and Goldbergs. It's kind of like a mishmash of who they release. So they try to mix it up with older guys and newer guys. So, I don't think any 8-year-old kids were really pining for a Hasbro style Iron Sheik figure.
Yeah, exactly. So the reason why I brought that up is because I have an affinity for that WCW line that they did with the really, really hard rubber, and they weren't posable at all. But I thought those looked super realistic from like the perspective of the models. Like I was really impressed with the artistry of those figures. I remember I had a photography class in high school, and one of the projects I did was basically creating Flair and Sting inside of a photograph because they looked so good. But what did you think about that line and sort of just the history of that line? Because there's similar stuff where they only released a handful, but if you go overseas, like people will say, oh yeah, they released these figures here. But just my memory of that line was that it just didn't last very long.
It didn't. That line was great. I had every single one of them. I loved that line. I was a huge WCW fan. I could actually pretty much tell you which guys I bought in which order. But what I found out later in life was that KB toy stores were the first stores to get them. And they got so many of them that even when they were selling, it felt like they weren't moving because they got so many of them. And by the point where they were in other stores like Toys R Us and stuff, pretty much everybody that wanted them had already had them. And it was at the point where KB was kind of clearing them out, and then they're popping up in Toys R Us and Kmart and stores like that at full price. So no one was buying them because they had already been cheap at KB toy stores. And like you said, there were some international releases, because one of the first things that I saw when I started at Figures Toy Company were some collections that my boss had bought off people through the years. And he had that El Gigante, and I had seen the Big Josh and the Dustin Rhodes and the Freebirds. So yeah, I had seen a lot of those releases, but I actually still have the Brian Pillman from that set mint on card.
Wow.
Because he's my favorite of all time. And when I started at Figures Toy Company, we still had older figures like Hasbro's and Galoob's being sold through the catalog. And one of the first things that I grabbed when I started there was a mint on card Brian Pillman that I still have.
Wow. So the last question before we get to your job that I have is, now the UFC and boxing never really branched off into a children's audience necessarily with the figures and just with just with merchandise and stuff. Now, my guess is boxing is a little tied up politically. You don't really have one company. It's a bunch of promoters, and I would imagine each fighter sort of has an individual license that you need to get a hold of. But also, it is a very adult, over 50 male dominated sport. So I imagine that's also some of it. But the UFC, I always thought it made sense to try and market some of these guys as bigger than life. But I guess part of that is also rehabbing guys who would lose. But you think of the biggest stars like a GSP. He was very much booked like an MMA superhero, right? Brock Lesnar, the big monster. So there were ways that I thought they could have marketed figures like that. But why do you think that that never took off for the UFC?
They tried it. Jax, who was the company that made WWE's figures for years up until Mattel took over, when they took over for Impact, they also got the UFC license. So this is around 2010 or so. And they were doing current people, and they even went kind of like, into the history, because they did like a Dan the Beast Severn and guys like that. I think at the time, though, it's just like you said, there is an audience for it, and that audience is probably more the older collector, the type of fans that you and I are familiar with, or the type of fans that we are. Mm-hmm. But to market them in a Walmart or a Target, I don't think that UFC is really going for that, 12, 13-year-old boy. I mean, sure, you get some fans, but, there wasn't any 12-year-old looking to get an Evan Tanner figure, maybe the guys like GSP or Tito Ortiz or Chuck Liddell, sure, but they went pretty deep into the lineups. And I think that was the thing, is that maybe they went too fast too soon with, guys like Evan Tanner and Chet Congo and guys like that, so that when those guys didn't sell, it kind of shot them in the foot. I think that for UFC, things like the Funko Pops are probably the best bet,
right?
Because they're quirky enough where like the non-toy collectors even look at them. But for the full-fledged action figures, I think it's very select for who you could do. Like if they came out now and did like a Connor figure and maybe like a Cormier, like kind of maybe like that core of like 5-6 guys, John Jones obviously. That you'll definitely move some, but I can't see them selling Colby Covingtons and stuff like that. I just don't see that happening.
Dana White would be the most bought figure. Wait, before the one more thing, you mentioned the Mattel. What? So who picks up that WWE license, or do they just kind of have a hold on it? Like, how does that work?
So Jax had the WWE license, and then when that expired, they went to Mattel. They're still with Mattel right now. Mattel, I believe, holds the license for like another 2 years, but usually towards the end of a contract, that's when all the other toy companies can kind of start investigating and making bids and making their pitches. Because, for instance, Mattel is losing the DC Comics 6-inch license to a company called Spin Master. And Spin Master is really famous for doing a lot of younger children's toy lines. Like they do like the Paw Patrol from Nickelodeon and kind of the stuff that the stuff that my son watches. So Mattel basically has to kind of fight for it every couple of years, or just decide if WWE renews. But then, for instance, with our company, which we can go further into, if we find out a license is, coming due, then we have to open up renegotiations and see if we have any competition there. So just like anything, just like making a bid for a sports team or anything, you just got to kind of make the sales pitch and try to make the best offer.
Do you think AEW can get their foot in the game a little bit, based on what we see as sort of wrestling insiders, and maybe I'm sure that's not sort of how you market this thing, but if they get a little bit of popularity, could you see that being something that they would get into?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially being on TNT and having that more mainstream coverage. You're going to be on a full-fledged cable channel. You're not going to be on one of those upper tier channels that you don't get with every package or anything. And you've already got some guys with name value. I mean, there's a million Cody Rhodes and Chris Jericho figures out there, but I think that in the collector's market, at least, they always want the most updated versions. Our company did the Young Bucks a couple of years ago. We did Kenny when he first started doing the cleaner gimmick in New Japan with the trench coat. I've got a Joey Janela figure coming out. So there are guys that are on the AEW roster that either already exist in that form or who are going to be coming out. As far as them obtaining a license, I could either see a company making an offer to them, or knowing those guys, them being proactive about it and coming after someone, whether it be a Mattel or a Hasbro or someone on a smaller scale like us who they've got a history with.
So let's talk about what you do for your company. I see a lot of stuff where you're posting press releases about someone that you've signed, and you're posting models of work that's been done on a figure. So being the chief marketing officer, your relationship with some of these guys, or the relationships that you create with these guys, is pretty valuable. But how did you get into this whole thing? And also, I'm assuming that a lot of what you do is wrestling, but are there other parts of the job that are not wrestling?
Oh yeah, I mean, we have a lot of other licenses, but how I got the job was actually not only through wrestling, but through collecting wrestling figures. Figures Toy Company used to advertise in the After Mags. There's usually like a 2 or 3 page ad, and my buddy wanted to order a Hasbro figure. It was actually a Hasbro Yokozuna figure. And the P.O. box was in the town of Johnston, Rhode Island, which is the town that I grew up in, and he lived the town over. So he gave them a call and he said, "You've got a P.O. box over here." He's like, "But I live 10 minutes from where that post office is. Do you have like a warehouse or a store?" And as it turned out, the warehouse was 5 minutes from his house. So we took a ride down there, and it was very much like a speakeasy, like ring the buzzer, we'll let you in.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't a storefront, there was no advertising or anything. But we walked in and there were a couple of old WCW VHS tapes strewn about. And what I found out later on was they were taking pictures for the new catalog of the new products that were coming in. But, you and I talk all the time about pop culture and stuff. You know how I'm wired about remembering things.
Yep.
And just, kind of start rattling off to my buddy. I'm like, "Oh, check it out, dude. Beach Blast 92 when Steamboat and Rude had that Iron Man match." And the guy who would become my boss turned around from his desk and he's like, "How the hell do you know that?" He's like, "You didn't pick that tape up. You didn't." He's like, "You knew that right off the top of your head." And I'm like, "Hey, I'm just a fan. Like that's how I am. I kind of memorize a lot of these things." And at the time, it was a very tight knit operation. It was a lot of family, guys he grew up with, people that he had known for years and years. And he said, "Listen," he's like, "I follow wrestling." He's like, "But I'm pretty much like a casual observer." He's like, "I know enough business wise, but I don't really know how to kind of get to the core of it all. And it sounds like you know a lot about it. Leave me your information, and if I can use you, I'll give you a call." 2 weeks later, it was the night before my 19th birthday. He gives me a call, says, "Can you come down and talk to me tomorrow?" And it was my 19th birthday, December 16th, 1999. I got hired on a handshake deal to just kind of be a jack of all trades. And here I am 20 years later as the chief marketing officer, running all the social media, pretty much in charge of the wrestling toy line. So that's the Ring of Honor license, the Rising Stars line, which focuses on the top current indie talent, and the Legends line, which takes the names from the past and turns them into action figures. And besides that, I've got some input in our other licenses, but my boss handles a lot of that stuff himself. But we have a license with Warner Brothers to do DC Comics characters and Hanna-Barbera characters in that retro, almost Mego-ish type of style. We've worked with the family of the Three Stooges, who maintain the rights to their likenesses and their estate. We've done the Monkees. We work with Kiss, and working with Kiss means you work with them directly. So all the approval comes from Simmons and Paul Stanley. So yeah, we're pretty out there as far as the variety of licenses that we've gotten and the ones that we've gotten to do.
So you mentioned the ROH license, and then the indie talent. I would imagine with the way that WWE's done business for the last several years, where they try and scoop up everybody, it probably made it hard to figure out who you guys can get. But with someone like an ROH, they have television in many markets because of their deal with their relationship with Sinclair, but it's not like they have that that worldwide spectrum that WWE has. Like when you're marketing an ROH line where you know that, okay, they don't even run shows on the West Coast, like how do you decide, where the figures are going to be and where to market them and who to market the hardest? Like what goes into that, the mindset of that as part of your job?
I mean, the thing with ROH is that, so the way the license works as far as ROH, and this is the same for, WWE with Mattel or any other type of company, is that anyone who's under an exclusive ROH contract, anyone who's not like a part-timer, is basically, we have carte blanche to add them to the line. So we've got the new line coming out. I've already posted sneak previews of Marty Scurll, PCO, Brody King. So for instance, Marty Scurll, a lot of people kind of see, is he going to be going to AEW? Is he going to go to WWE? Is he going to stay in ROH? So even if he leaves, that figure's already entered production. That figure can come out. So even though it will be under the ROH brand, that's not going to stop a collector from getting a Marty Scurll figure.
Sure.
So the marketing can be tricky because some of these guys are signing these contracts that only last for a year or so, which is pretty much the same for production. That's why if you go to Target or Walmart and you go to the toy aisle and see a WWE guy, they're in a costume from like last year's SummerSlam or last year's WrestleMania.
Right.
Because even a company like Mattel, it takes them about a year to do that. So the marketing can get tricky because you're trying to market them as ROH figures, but then if that guy's already jumped ship, you don't want to tag WWE when you're promoting the Ring of Honor brand. So, you just kind of have to, push the individual at that point. But I mean, as far as pushing ROH as a whole, I do it all over our social media. We sell the figures exclusively online. I have a variety of wholesalers worldwide. I've had UK distributors, Canadian distributors, people out on the West Coast, people in Middle America, people here on the East Coast. So I'm always pushing not only the product for ourselves, but for people to get them in their comic book shops or their collector stores or their sporting goods stores, so that people that might not be as familiar with the talent, that might just be collectors or might just want to see something cool, can actually see them. And that's why I'll do things like podcasts and interviews and stuff like that, because, they always say the more publicity, the better. And I definitely believe that, especially with something that can be considered kind of a niche product like ROH, even though they've come a long way from 2002. And they've got, things like the arrangement with New Japan and working with CMLL. Like you said, there's still a very devout hardcore wrestling fan base that doesn't know much about them, let alone about some of the guys that they've got under contract. So it's really all about, the visual aspect of it too. When those sculpts and those designs come in, letting people see this is what this figure is going to look like. Or anytime that I mention that we've got a figure in stock, always putting it, a picture of it out of the package, in the package, so people know exactly what they're getting and can kind of get the full detail of what these ROH figures are like.
Would someone like a Juice Robinson qualify for a Rising Stars, or because he is with New Japan, that sort of excludes him from you guys being able to work with him, or anybody sort of in that same department?
Nope, I've actually got Juice coming in the Rising Stars line, thanks to our mutual buddy Jeff Cobb. Because Jeff, we did Jeff in the Rising Stars line, and that is one guy, I have to say it, and I'm not saying it just to blow smoke up anybody's butt, one of the absolute nicest guys I've ever had the pleasure of meeting, let alone working with. He's been super cool from day one, and what I really appreciate about it is that he was so appreciative to be in our line that he kind of gives me a little bit of credibility in that, inner circle of the wrestling world, and not only me, but the brand itself. And he hit me up at the CEO show last year because he was on that show. And he's like, I got a couple of guys here that are really interested in the action figures. Like, do you want to talk to a couple of them? And I'm like, yeah, sure. Who you got? And it was Juice Robinson, David Finlay, and Chase Owens. And he helped me get those guys based on how happy he was with his figure. And those guys were able to do it because even though they're working with New Japan, I guess, before we got to that era of everybody getting tied up in exclusive contracts again, they were basically only contracted per tour. So merchandise-wise and rights-wise and likeness-wise, they had the ability to control their own destiny as far as merchandising, and signed up to do the action figures with us.
Oh,
so all those guys are coming in the Rising Stars.
Yeah, that's really cool. So who's coming soon? And any figures that you're super excited about because you've seen the molds or you've seen some of the thought process going behind it coming up soon?
Yeah, I mean, from Ring of Honor, we've got all three guys from Villain Enterprises. I've posted those likenesses. We've got Bandito and Mark Haskins coming, and I think that Bandito figure is going to look killer. I've only posted the sculpts for those guys, but I've seen the design aspect as far as what the outfit and the color schemes are going to look like, and I'll get those up soon. But just, they're things that are really going to pop. They're really going to stand out. I've seen a lot more of the ROH roster. I've seen some of the Women of Honor, which will be the first time we've done any of them. But I've seen Mandy Leone, Kelly Klein, and Angelina Love and Velvet Sky. So those four women, those will actually probably be the next ones that we show over the next couple of weeks. But I know a lot of fans have always been asking where the Women of Honor were. So we wanted to make sure that we included them in this go around. We're doing updates to the Briscoes and Jay Lethal. Those three were some of our original releases. And now we're doing the updated Jay Lethal with the bald head. The Briscoes, obviously, their likenesses change depending on how much they grow their beard and their hair out. So we're doing like a more modern aspect look of the Briscoes. Just, really, really cool updates from the Rising Stars line. A lot of guys that are doing big things. We've got Joey Janela coming out, and he's in AEW, and I have no doubt that he'll be a national name sooner than later. Shane Strickland is now in WWE in NXT as Isaiah Scott. So if he gains popularity on NXT or 205 Live or wherever they want to stick him, then that's good for us, because even though he'll be marketed and pitched as the Shane Strickland figure, if a guy gains momentum in the most visible promotion in the world right now, that can only mean good things for us, especially if you're someone who's collecting those Mattel figures and you see this guy and you're like, well, when's he coming out? Oh, wait, this company already has him. Boom, let me jump on that. And then it steers people towards us. So lots of stuff I'm really looking forward to as far as the indie talent and the new talent. And then the Legends line, I mean, probably the most humbling thing was getting in touch with Chris Candido's brother and him giving us the rights to Chris's estate and his likeness to do the first Chris Candido figure in 20 years since the days of him being in ECW. So I'm really looking forward to that one, because that'll be the first time he was done in any modern capacity.
So we're gonna have to figure out how to talk about the Beverly Hills 90210 show that's coming out, and try and figure out how to relate it to wrestling, maybe through Jungle Boy somehow. I don't know. But at some point, we'll have to chit-chat again. But before I let you go, what is your ultimate sort of holy grail collectible that you do not have yet?
That I do not have yet. Oof, that is a loaded question. I wish I still had a lot of my He-Man guys mint on card. That's for sure. Some of those pieces, obviously through age and stuff, kind of fell apart and everything like that. So I just wish that I had some of those original play sets and stuff like that still, mint, still displayable and everything, because I mean, that was my favorite thing to collect besides wrestling stuff growing up. I mean, the Incredible Hulk stuff was, like I said, it was a sentimental thing, and my family was always on the lookout for it. But the one thing that always made me excited besides wrestling figures was that Masters of the Universe line. And especially now with the movie coming out next year and it kind of being brought to the forefront again, the collector's edition figures that they make now, they're just super expensive, and you got to worry about which one's an exclusive and how to get your hands on this one. So I kind of just pick and choose them, but it would be really cool to kind of have that full collection again, someday, when I hit the lottery.
All right, so where can folks find you, and also the social media and all that stuff for the company, as they, Facebook and Twitter and all that stuff?
Yep, Figures Toy Company. The official website is www.figurestoycompany.com. We also own and operate WrestlingSuperstore.com, so that's a subsidiary where you can find a little bit more variety of wrestling merchandise, T-shirts, action figure accessories, replica belts, DVDs, stuff like that. Both pages are across all forms of social media, so if you search Figures Toy Company or Wrestling Superstore on Facebook and Instagram, the company pages will come up for you. They're both on Twitter at Figures Toy Co. and at WRES_Superstore. And if you want to seek me out personally, I am on Twitter and Instagram at Zach Malibu. That's ZACKMALIBU.
All right, man. Thanks for coming on.
All right. Thanks for having me, dude.
Okay.